Folks, we'll be getting started in a few minutes, but hopefully everybody's noticed there's coffee, water, cookies in the back, so feel free to avail yourself of that. And then when you do have a seat, please sit in the central section here because our speaker's requesting she have everybody in front of her so she doesn't have to look over there all the time. Thank you. Well, good evening, everyone. To those of you who are here in the room with us physically, welcome. To those of you who are joining us online, welcome. Glad you could join us. I'm pleased to see students and faculty here tonight. Pleased to see alumni here tonight. That's exciting, and maybe there's even a few of those online. Also pleased to see some classical educators from the region who are here tonight. So thank you all for being here. Glad we could share this time together. My name is Scott Hewlin, and sorry, I had to think about that for a second. And I direct the honors community at Union University and am a professor of English, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this fourth lecture in our 2022 Scholar in Residence lecture series entitled The Scandal of Holiness, featuring Dr. Jessica Hooten Wilson. If you were here for any of the other lectures, you've heard me introduce her in several different ways as a very accomplished scholar in the field of religion and literature, and as a advocate and nurturer of classical Christian education, and as a cultural critic and social media personality of sorts, you might say. I think she would chafe at that, but I think that's, whether you like it or not, I think that's happening. After all, you do have a YouTube channel, let's just be clear. So, and these are all things that are interesting and fascinating about her, but I want to give you probably the most important reason for why your time here tonight will be well spent. Earlier today, at the third lecture that Dr. Wilson gave, she talked about the importance of living what we read. And one of the things that impresses me most about Dr. Wilson is that she is indeed someone who lives what she reads. And by that, I don't just mean Dostoevsky and Flannery O'Connor and all those folks, although she does live those too in important ways. But especially her reading of the scriptures and of the church fathers and of other important theologians in the history of the church. There are lots of people who talk about theology, but not all of them practice the knowledge of God. And there are lots of people who talk about prayer and different ways to pray, but not all of them pray. And there are lots of people who talk about the virtues and the importance of the virtues, but don't actually work very hard at practicing and developing those virtues. And we are blessed tonight to learn from somebody who actually does all those things. She doesn't just go around places recommending them, but she actually, in fact, does them. And I think that's one of the things that comes out most strongly as you listen to her and as you engage with her in conversation after the lecture tonight. I think it'll be quite evident to you that these things are all true of her. Dr. Wilson did her undergraduate degree in creative writing at Pepperdine University, did a master's at the University of Dallas, and did her PhD at Baylor University under the inimitable Ralph Wood. And that will leave you marked forever, right? in so many good ways. We're delighted to have her here for this lecture series that's based on the content of a book that that has just come out called The Scandal of Holiness. We actually have copies of the book available here tonight, so if you find yourself enjoying these lectures and wanting to dig in more, we'd invite you to pick up a signed copy of the book after the lectures. The book's not yet available on Amazon or anywhere else. You can only get it here. This is the only place in the world that you can buy this book right now and get your hands on it. And we're selling it for $5 cheaper than Amazon or will be selling it. So why not, give Union the money instead of Jeff Bezos, right? So anyway, we'll have the book available after that, after the lecture tonight. But our fourth lecture in the series, in which she's been inviting us to think about how it is that literature can help sanctify our imagination. The fourth lecture tonight is called The Ars Moriendi, that is the arts of dying. How is it that we can die like Jesus? So please join me in welcoming Dr. Jessica Hooten-Wilson.
Thank you for that introduction. You just made me cry before I came on, so I hopefully don't have a bunch of just black everywhere. Yes, I wear makeup. These aren't just my eyelashes. So apologies if I do, but I really appreciate that. I might cry again right now. I love the Lord. I'm only doing this because I love the Lord. And as I quoted at the Augustine School on Friday, Marie de France says, anyone who has been given a desire for knowledge and the gift of true eloquence has a duty to not remain silent. And so I take that as a vocation, that I am called to give these gifts, to be away from my children right now, who I love, to be away from my family, because I believe that the Lord is planting seeds and I'm letting him do what he wills with my gifts. So I'm grateful to hear that has been happening, and I hope that it continues to happen tonight, so thank you. I want to open with a prayer by Howard Thurman. If you don't know who Howard Thurman is, he was a theologian, before the time of Martin Luther King Jr., and Martin Luther King Jr. used to carry around Jesus and the Disinherited, which was his book, everywhere that he went. He actually carried it in every single suitcase. And so it was one of those books that meant a lot to him, that shaped who he was. And so Thurman was very influential in the civil rights movement, even though you're not seeing him on the television, you're not seeing him at the forefront of that cause. And Thurman, just to give you one small story, because it's fascinating to me for what it suggests about the man, I recently put together a great books collection, a reader of great text, and we used Thurman's prayers in it, which means I needed to receive permission from his estate in order to reprint those prayers. His grandson called me to ask me questions about my faith, and they give all the money for permissions to churches. So the permissions money you have to spend, the family gets none of it. To this day, his legacy continues to give the money to churches. And that's how much he's borne fruit, that his grandson, generations later, wants to call and hear about, what are you using the prayers for? And are you using them for the glory of God? I think that's a beautiful testimony to Howard Thurman as a man. So I'm going to start with his prayer tonight. If you get interested, there are lots of Howard Thurman prayers online, and they're lovely. So they will add a lot to your devotional life. but we'll start with this one. Open unto us light for our darkness. Open unto us courage for our fears. Open unto us peace for our turmoil. Open unto us joy for our sorrow. Open unto us strength for our weakness. Open unto us wisdom for our confusion. Open unto us forgiveness for our sins. Open unto us love for our hates. Open unto us thyself for ourselves. Lord, Lord, open unto us. Amen. So I'm talking about Ars Moriendi, and I began thinking about the art of death probably at an unhealthy age. I was really obsessed with dark things when I was a little kid, and I actually had visited this bone church when I was a child in Rome that I just completely fascinated me. And the entire church is made of bones. So they've taken the remains of people and they've turned it into chandeliers and into decorations on the walls, and it's called a bone church. So when I was living in Prague, I took my husband and at that time I think she was 6 months old, my daughter, to another bone church. It's called the Sedlick Ossuary. And my husband was freaked out by all of these bones. I mean, it's thousands of bones just everywhere you look. Like every wall, every ceiling is just covered in bones. And it was meant for you to reflect on your death, right? You're walking into this place and you're thinking beyond this life. You're reflecting on your death in order to remember Christ, right? In order to remember where you're going when you die. And but it made my husband so uncomfortable. I mean, he really hated it. Like he like straight through that church as fast as he could. So I'm sitting there just reflecting on the bone chandeliers, and my husband fled, right, as quick as he could. So what is this? I don't know. What is this hesitancy that we have against thinking about death? Why do we find it so uncomfortable? I mean, I'm one of those people that I can sit at a dinner table and say, like, what do you want on your tombstone? I find that a really fascinating question to ask people. Like, what do you want somebody to say about you when you die? Does anyone else do that? Right? Or, you know, I'll talk to my parents, like, where do you want to be buried? And none of it bothers me, but there is a lot of hesitancy with people. They don't think about dying. One of the novels that I read along these lines is called Memento Mori, right? Remember your death. And it's a bunch of octogenarians are all the characters. So they're all maybe close to death. I don't want to like curse any 80-year-olds in the room right now, but they might be close to death in their 80s, and they start having these phone calls, and the only voice on the other end says, "Remember, you must die." And so they get freaked out. It becomes like kind of this like mystery novel, and then you just realize it's just death calling them and giving them a heads up. Because how do you live differently if you remember you must die? You will die. Alexander Solzhenitsyn said the reason he knew that we were not supposed to live for our own happiness was death. Because if you're going to die, right, it confronts all of your ideas that you're only living for your own happiness. Death flies in the face of that. When we imagine that we're living out these stories, and that's most of what I've talked about the last several days, when we imagine living out our stories and it's being authored by someone else, what kind of ending do you want that story to have? What would that look like for you? I think I mentioned this in a faculty lunch, but my dad used to have this pastor that if you asked him how he was doing, he would say, "I don't know yet, I haven't finished." Right? I don't know how I'm doing until I end. I need to know how I ran the whole race to know whether I've done well, to know whether it was a good life. Lydia Dugdale just wrote this book a few years ago called In the Lost Art of Dying Well. And it used to be that you would have these Ars Moriendi manuals because death was such a common occurrence, and that when people died and they were in your home, right, you took care of the bodies. You prepared the dead. You didn't ship them off for someone else to take care of. They were in your spaces and in your home. And Lydia Dugdale, who's actually a physician, and she's a teacher of medicine at Columbia, she said she'll have people where they find out, they receive some diagnosis that they're going to die, and they don't know how to respond, right? They're not ready for that. They've never thought of it before. And all of a sudden, they're confronted with their own mortality, and they have no resources for understanding how to die well. Dugdale says, in failing to die well, we fail to live well. By avoiding the questions of the meaning of death, we avoid the questions of the meaning of life. By avoiding our finitude, we ignore infinitude. So how we end completes the picture. It tells the story. Either it exposes the lie of a self-determined existence, or it points beyond itself to an infinite good. Now, there's not only one way to die well, but in my book, I talk about lots of different ways of dying well. But in the course of this talk tonight, I'm only going to talk about one particular way of dying well. But Dugdale goes through several different ways of dying well. Having your community around you, having a virtuous disposition, how to be remembered after you die. I think that this reminder of death teaches us that we never really belonged to ourselves. We always belonged to a community. We always belonged to those who will remember us. We belonged to others. Now, the saints, by God's provision, within the Catholic and within the Protestant church, whether they were canonized or not canonized, the saints are often triumphing over this universal fear of death. When Jesus faces death, right, he says, yes, this cup to pass for me if it be your will. But he faces it like a lamb going to slaughter, right? Not a word was heard from his mouth. There's a fearlessness that exemplifies how we are all to approach our death. You have in the Protestant church, of course, the Fox's Book of Martyrs. We always uplift the stories of Jim Elliot. In the Catholic Church, you have a lot of martyrs who end up becoming saints, right? When we look at what holiness looks like. My daughter, I bought her this children's book of saints. It's beautiful illustrations. And she went through and counted which ones ended violently, right? Or which ones, instead of being martyrs, got to live peacefully to their end. So she can actually tell you which ones end violently or not. Unfortunately, that's what I'm going to talk about tonight, is just the violent martyr kind of death. And, Lord, may it not be so for anyone in this room. But the reason I want to focus on it is because you know that dying for Christ in that way, right? There is a sanctity to that. You get to go all the way to the end, having professed what you believed and literally dying for what you believed, right? So it's one of those kinds of noble deaths that you can't deny. If someone believed so much they were willing to die. That's why it became the seeds of the church, as Tertullian says, right? Because that was a witness. There was no selfishness in giving up your life for the church. Now, nowadays, we don't really have that kind of persecution in American circles, right? But what would it look like in parallel to imagine yourself as dying to self here and now? What does it look like to be able to face mortality without fear? If we look at Dante's Divine Comedy, he deals with martyrs, but I think he draws a great parallel for his own calling as a poet, as a kind of martyrdom in analogy. So let me look at that story. So when the pilgrim Dante ventures into heaven, you get to see all these different saints, right, who are reflecting themselves, and they're talking about what sanctification looks like. And in the fifth circle of paradise, which is the realm of Mars, right, the god of war, it reflects there the souls of the martyrs, those who exemplified the virtue of courage. And the souls dance together and they create this cross. So it shows that the cruciform life, right, is the life of the martyr. And from this gathering, Dante has a conversation with his ancestor, with his great-grandfather. So you see also why I started with Thurman and his grandson. Dante is greeted by Cacciaguida, his ancestor, who died in the Second Crusade as a warrior for Christ. But Cacciaguida does not tell Dante it is your calling to be a crusader in order to show the virtue of courage.
Instead, he says a different kind of suffering will be thrust upon Dante. You'll leave behind everything you love most dearly. This will be the arrow shot from the first bow of exile. Dante's calling will look different, but it'll still require the virtue of a martyr. It'll still require the death to self that Cacciaguida showed in his death to life. Dante will be undeservedly exiled from Florence, and the arrows that strike him will not be literal but figurative. In order to fulfill his calling as a warrior for Christ, Dante must not pick up a sword, but a pen. He must counteract the injustice by writing honestly, no matter how much it offends the church at the time. Dante understands that this is the courage being demanded of him, and he writes, "But if I'm a too timid friend of truth, with those who will call these days the days of old, I fear I'll lose that fame that lengthens youth." I'm going to read it again, because this is actually a phrase that I almost use like a mantra. The necessity of not being too timid, a friend of truth. But if I'm a too timid friend of truth, with those who will call these days the days of old, I fear I'll lose the fame that lengthens youth. So his martyrdom will be acting bravely in response to injustice. Sometimes we now call this speaking truth to power, right? Like in modern lingo. So let's look at a story by Ernest Gaines called A Lesson Before Dying. It really embodies Ars Moriendi. It is all about memento mori, because from the beginning to the end of the book, it is about one man going to his death. We may not have a lot of persecution in our culture if you are a white middle-class American in the church, but the Black church in America has consistently seen the victims of slavery and lynching and civil rights antagonism and executed innocent people as martyrs. And they have visualized this or imagined this as a martyrdom for Christ. County Cullen in the 1930s, he describes Jesus as the first leaf in a line of trees on which man would swing. He imagines lynching as a participation in the suffering of Christ. Because they follow Christ in their innocence and in suffering violent deaths, and in a way that their deaths are lived on in communal memory, these victims of racism become transformed in the imagination of the African American church as martyrdom. So if we are to find examples of what martyrdom looks like in America in the 21st century, we don't have to look much farther than our neighbors. Ernest Gaines publishes this novel in 1994, but he sets it in the 1940s before the Civil Rights Act was signed. In the novel, an innocent man is convicted of murder and he's executed. And how he goes to his death teaches us what it looks like to die. Hopefully only dying to self, but even that can be a very big ask. The 21-year-old Jefferson is the main character. He's an African American who's in the wrong place at the wrong time. He hitches a ride with two men who decide to rob a bar, and the two men and the bartender start shooting at one another, so the two black men end up killing the white man, and they're both killed, and it leaves Jefferson standing there, having had nothing to do with the crime. But when a black man is standing over a white body in 1940s South, someone has to pay. Now, the narrator is not Jefferson, but a man named Grant Wiggins, who is a teacher, and they both grew up on the same plantation. But because Grant actually received an education, he becomes a school teacher, and he has this ambition to exit and escape the quarter he grew up in. And in the first lines of the novel, he tells you, "I wasn't there, yet I was there in the courtroom." He's speaking about this trial. He said, "I did not go to the trial, I did not hear the verdict, because I knew all the time what it would be. And still I was there. I was there as much as anyone was there." He invites us to experience this connection between the life of his life and the life of his people. They all share a fate of suffering that seems inevitable to them. And the opening lines can also be read mysteriously, right? Wiggins was there as much as anyone was there because no one was noticing that these black people were there. Only when the defending attorney dehumanizes Jefferson before the jury, does the black audience become invigorated. So they've been listening. At one point, the godmother is explained like her eyes are glassed over She's stopping looking at her godson as though he's going to ever survive this. She knows that he's going to be convicted before the trial even begins. But she wakes up when the defense attorney says something. He calls Jefferson a cornered animal, an empty skull, a thing to handle a plow, a thing to load bales of cotton. Why, I would as soon put a hog in the electric chair as this. And it's at that moment that she wakes up. The insult becomes a catalyst for the rest of the story, for her action, and she tells Wiggins he has to educate Jefferson before his execution. Change him from a hog into a man in the little time he's got left, she says. If Jefferson must die, he must die a human being in the eyes of everyone there. Now, Wiggins resists this calling. Here's a man who wants to escape. He wants to have nothing to do with this. He doesn't even know himself, he says, what it means to be a person. He says, if I don't know how to die, how do I teach another man how to die? These are the same questions, of course, that Lydia Dugdale had pointed out that most people refuse to face. What does it mean to be human is directly related to what does it mean to die. So we cannot imagine how we're going to die, and therefore we don't prepare for that thought, right? Dugdale says we suffer a deficit in the imagination. Now, if we're prevented from contemplating our own finitude, this novel forces us to face those questions of how we are going to die. We vicariously face them in the fiction. What does it mean to die well? Against his desire and recognizing his own inadequacy, Wiggins does undertake the schooling of Jefferson. While Wiggins does not know how to die, he encourages Jefferson to be a hero. In one of the most moving parts of the story, they go to visit Jefferson in prison, and it's his godmother, and it's a reverend, and it's Jefferson, and they bring him gumbo, which is his favorite meal, and he's not eating a bite of it. And so Wiggins and Jefferson decide to walk around the room, and Jefferson is in his chains, and you can hear them as he's shuffling around the room, chained up, talking to Wiggins, not knowing what to do. And Wiggins says, I want you to show them. And he's talking about the white people who convicted Jefferson. I want you to show them the difference between what they think you are and what you are. Now they're whispering this, they're having this passionate pep talk. And he says, to them, you're nothing. No dignity, no heart, no love for your people, but you can prove them wrong. A hero does for others, Wiggins tells him. Now, I'm no hero, but you can be. You can be bigger than anyone you've ever met. The chance to be a hero has been thrust upon Jefferson because of the conviction, because of the looming execution. His death is inevitable, but how he chooses to die is up to him. He has agency in how he dies. He can die as a hog or he can die as a hero. Wiggins refers to a man they both knew named Mr. Farrell. And this passage to me is the most Christian passage in the story. He says, do you remember Mr. Farrell who used to craft slingshots out of driftwood? You've seen how he makes a slingshot handle. He starts with a little piece of rough wood, any scrap of wood, and he starts cutting. Cutting and cutting and cutting, then shaving. Shaves it down clean and smooth till it's not what it was before, but something new and pretty. For Christians, how much does this sound like the Lord who calls himself our potter and we are the clay? This is the metaphor, and the shaping is painful. You don't want the Lord to be cutting and cutting and cutting and shaving at you. But that's the necessary transformation. It's the transformation that Jefferson is going through, really against his will. But he's being shaped into something new and beautiful by this process. It's a mysterious reality. If Wiggins is right, that's all we are. All of us on earth are a piece of driftwood, he says. But God carves us into something more. In this story, the Lord is reshaping Jefferson into an imitator of Christ through this persecution before death. So how are we to die, and how is this to do with how we live? So for the Reverend in the story, the answer is obvious. The Reverend thinks that you believe in Jesus Christ, and that's the answer. But Wiggins and Jefferson understand that such a profession could just be words. It could just be lies. Over a century ago, George MacDonald, who was known for his, fantastical fiction, he was actually a preacher. And he preached, instead of asking yourself whether you believe or not, ask yourself whether you have this day done what he said to do. That's the bigger question. What matters is the actions, not that the deeds earn rewards, but that they exhibit the faith you profess. When Wiggins and Jefferson are discussing God, Wiggins says, I think it's God that makes people care for other people, Jefferson. I think it's God that makes children play and makes people sing. Now for Jefferson, there's no more time for playing and singing and loving. And so he tells Wiggins, then I'm going to die like Christ died. Never mumbling a word, that's how I want to go, Mr. Wiggins, not mumbling a word. So just as we mentioned how the lamb was led to the slaughter, this is how Jefferson decides to go. And he protests it. This is not something that comes easy to him, just like Christ crying out, not wanting to go this way, but thy will be done. Jefferson says, me take a cross, your cross, Nanan's cross, my cross, that's asking a lot. But Jefferson does take up the cross. As he writes in the diary a prayer that reveals so much like the prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane, he says, I've been shaken and shaken and shaken, but I'm gonna be strong. Tell them I'm strong, Mr. Wiggins. Tell them I was a man. Gaines tells the end of the story from other people's perspective. As Jefferson is led to be executed, so the Lord was led to be crucified, and it's the disciples that we get to hear about. We get to see what the townspeople are up to as Jefferson is being executed. Some are kneeling, some are praying, some are hiding, some are closing their shops. Wiggins himself is too scared to go to the execution, and so he's at a distance. And we see in all of these different accounts that the death is just like that passage in John, unless a seed dies, it bears no fruit. But here we see fruit being born in the community, the most noble of which is Paul, the white guard, who took Jefferson to his execution. He relays all of the actions that Wiggins had missed because of Wiggins' cowardice. He tells how Jefferson walked like a man to that chair. Straight he walked, I'm a witness, Paul says. Just like a man who's been converted. And that's, of course, why he's named Paul. He talks about witnessing Jefferson's death. And after he watches this death, he's ready himself. Paul is ready for a new life. He wants to be friends with Wiggins. He wants to give up the color line. He wants to go across it. And he shakes Wiggins' hands and said, I don't want to ever forget till the day I die what Jefferson did. He's going to live differently because he saw the transformation that happens in Jefferson. He said that Jefferson was the bravest man in that room. It was the courage of a martyr. Now, the story of Jefferson is not real. It's fictional. We don't even have his last name. But of course, stories like this are true all over this country and have been for hundreds of years in this country, and we cannot change that past. But we can remember those stories. That's what the community of the living does. They remember the death of the martyrs, and they lament the death of the martyrs, and they learn from the death of the martyrs, and they bear fruit in the community that they're in. They respond with bravery. They respond with courage. We learn to repent, I think, of complicity in racism the way that Paul does in this novel, where he attempts friendship and declaration instead, saying, I don't want to ever forget. And as we approach our death, we must face the question, did I contribute to the problem, or did I do all that I could have to not be a too timid friend of truth? Did I take up the cross? We just had Ash Wednesday last week, and I always attend an Ash Wednesday service in which they tell you from dust you came and dust you shall return. And it never moved me that much, honestly. It was something that I did, and it was part of the church, and I was grateful for that time until I took my daughter. And when you're holding your 1-year-old and someone puts dust on her head in the shape of a cross and says that she's from dust and she will return to dust, you realize you too don't belong to yourself, and your daughter doesn't belong to you. She belongs to him, and you belong to him, and you will return to dust. And it's a sobering thought, and it's a difficult thought to face, that that's where we came from, and that's where we will return. I have a friend who did a graduation speech, and she got up in front of a bunch of college graduates and said, "Nobody's going to remember you in a few generations," right? You will not only die, you'll be forgotten. That's a sobering thought. But it's true. So what then do we do? How then do we live if we're going to die and we're going to be forgotten? Well, suddenly life isn't about fame, and it's not about success in any worldly sense. It's about living well and dying well. It's about loving others more than yourself. It's about facing that death. It's about my love for my daughter. I love her as long as she has breath in her, and I don't care that no one will remember her when she's gone, because my love is not dependent on that any more than God's love is dependent on us being remembered here in this life. And I think this is the perpetual witness of our church, not in names and not in fame, but in love. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wilson. We've got some time for discussion, so if you have a question, please make your way to one of the microphones in the aisles here to make sure everybody in the room can hear and the folks online can hear.
I feel like you all just need to breathe deeply after. Okay. But feel free to ask questions. I really enjoy the conversation. And it doesn't have to be about this lecture. If you have lingering questions from previous ones too, I'm happy to have other conversations. Yes?
I think it's one thing that is difficult to think about and meditate on your own death, but I think it's another thing that is more difficult to think about and meditate your loved one's deaths, or people you're not close to's deaths. To talk about that, or to be with someone as they're dying, and or for people in the medical field and nursing, or who want to be doctors. I was just wondering if you had any reflections on, I don't know, being a midwife for people's souls as they die.
Yeah. I don't know that I have a ton of wisdom. I do turn to literature. So literature becomes kind of this practice or case study place for experiencing those things that we don't directly experience ourselves. So one of the things that I cannot remember who, I think it's Brene Brown, that just wrote on emotions or something, and the number of emotions that people can realize. So most people can only name 5 emotions. The difference is people who read literature. Because of the various emotions you experience, and you learn how to call those emotions out, you learn how to recognize them in different people, you learn how to name things. So even the experience of death, you get to practice that in a way that I think makes you more comfortable, that you're able to see the immortal as well as the mortal in those moments. Whereas I don't think most of our experiences, especially in culture, give us that opportunity, because they're always hiding death or pushing it to the side. And so I think literature, for me, is one of the best ways to practice that, to really have to deal with death and reflect on what death is novels and poetry. Paul Mariani has a great book, Death and Other Transfigurations, is what it's called, which I think is a neat title. But he's in his 80s, and he's reflecting on the coming death, right? It builds that interior life. It thickens your soul. I think there's a lot. So I'm really not being paid by the English department to just kind of pitch English classes all the time. It just happens to be that I just believe a lot in the power of reading and what it can do. So, yes.
One of the things I thought about you mentioned that, like, in our culture, we have a large distancing from death. Do you think, I know other cultures approach death differently. Do you think this is a global trend or just like an American culture thing as well?
Unfortunately, it's becoming a global trend. So Dugdale actually documents it from around the world. It's more of a current 21st century. And it's kind of if you read her book, it's kind of horrifying how much it has happened. Especially, so in cultures like right now in Japan, they have so many single people living by themselves and dying and not being found for years. And they're just, because they're all siloed off. And so it's actually a constant thing right now. So they have, and this is happening in New York too, just really big cities where people are dying alone and not being found for a very long time. Until, I mean, I won't get graphic, but until it's really disturbing. And you don't even know who they are. And then you have to employ whole agencies by the government to figure out who people are and like verify, because so much of them is not left. That's so disturbing, right? That these people are being left alone to die. So yes, right now it's a world problem.
So do you think it would be beneficial to look at death as more of a communal, like, practice?
Yes, and so that's one of the, in my book, I talk about several different ways of dying. One of them I mentioned is I really reflect on community. So it used to be that you would have a community around your bedside, and you gave your last words, you gave your last testimony. I mean, death was something that you invited everyone into, whereas more and more people aren't telling their family members if they're in hospice, because they don't want people around when they die. They're ashamed of dying. They don't want other people to be inconvenienced by their death. And so they're preferring to die alone, right? And I don't think in those last moments anyone should be alone. So Dugdale's book is fantastic for looking at this, but there is a lot of literature where you get to see people's communal deaths and how beneficial it can be.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Dr. Wilson, any thoughts on distinction between funerals and the implied grieving that comes with those versus celebrations of life?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, our words matter, right? And how we approach death starts to matter. One of my friends, unfortunately, was at a student suicide, and everyone ignored what had happened. It was an entire celebration of life that did not admit that this young man had taken his own life. And so you were, in some sense, you weren't able to properly grieve or deal with that trauma, that tragedy that had happened. You're missing the necessary mourning, right? And also then the necessary reflection on what happened. As a community, as an individual in that ceremony, right? You need the funerals rather than just celebration of life. Thomas Lynch, I read a lot on death. I know this is going to sound like I'm such a weirdo. Thomas Lynch is a poet who is actually a funeral director in Minnesota. And he wrote an entire book it's actually really humorous essays about people's deaths, because the number of people who don't know how to grieve or die in this country. So, for example, one man dies and his family doesn't know how to bury him, so they bring his golf bag and they cremate him and put him in his golf bag. What a loss, like, for the family to not know how to do anything but pour ashes into a golf bag to say goodbye, right? So it's really frightening to me that our culture doesn't know how to let people go, to experience the end of life, to reflect on death, to mourn, right? Rather than to move past it. In COVID, I don't know how many of you lost family members, but we lost a dear friend of ours. My friend lost her father. Like, we lost people that were close to us. And I think it was also very troubling to see that as death was more prominent around us, people just kind of were trying to move past it very quickly, right? And not mourn over it and just treat it like, yeah, I lost a friend to COVID. And just moving so quickly through something that was so tragic, really. We've lost that.
I'm going to go first because I think mine relates, and also because Dr. Thomas is kind. So I was thinking, this bone church is fascinating, which I didn't even know existed.
Oh, there's several of them.
Yeah, I'm going to look them up now.
They're
so thank
super
you.
fun.
I'll go,
They're
well,
super
they're
fun. You're going to go on
fascinating.
this rabbit trail of looking at bone churches.
Well, and I guess it was making me think about a lot of things, but one, it is a very visible way in which one's life is given to other people, because their actual bones are made into a place that you go into. But it made me think about how in our ordinary lives, we often receive things from people who've died. So we might have, things from our grandmothers or grandfathers and things in our homes. And I thought it might be helpful to hear you talk about, one of the ways those artifacts we can engage them is really just nostalgia. And that's not necessarily bad. I mean, remembrance in good ways. But I just wondered if you could help us think through how to let those markers of their, maybe just even physical, tangible artifacts, help us reflect on what the ultimate questions at stake, and not just missing the old good times.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, and again, I think this is one of the ways that novels is really helpful, because when you read the story and someone dies, you go back and read the story again, and you're able to see things and not repaint it or recast it incorrectly, which with nostalgia, we're basing things on our memory, and so we can recast or romanticize someone's life from what it was. Now, I do think the process of remembering should also lead to a future. There's a book by Greg Jones that it's about business leaders. This may sound like it's not connected, but I think it is. It's called Traditioned Innovation, or Innovating Tradition, something like that, in which you don't want to fall for nostalgia or futurism, because both are paralyzing. Right, so both can, in a sense, become a death to self. If you live only in a viewpoint of nostalgia, you're not recognizing how the past pertains to the present. And if you're living in futurism, you're not thinking about the present and its relationship to the future. So you're building a rose-colored vision of the future that's not based on where we are now. So instead, memory is supposed to be an interaction between the present, future, and past altogether. That's what it should be participating in. And so when we have kind of these tangible things, we have that in the present, that there's a memory even being created there, right? It's going to hopefully, because it's tangible, be passed on to the future. And so we get to tell the story of the thing from the past passing to the future that's part of the present. So there's a way of kind of protecting that rather than falling into one of those fallacies.
I recently finished John Mark Comer's book, Live No Lies, which I found to be wonderfully insightful. And it suggests itself as a way, as a question from, I guess, a different angle. Since previous cultures developed the art of dying with some sophistication and some regularities as part of their practices, then what lies are we living with that when we approach our own mortality, we ought to be aware of and perhaps self-consciously resist?
Yeah, so one of the things I go into is autonomy. And so when I look at kind of this communal way of dying, I look at and rejecting the lie of autonomy, right? Any more than you didn't decide when you were going to be born to decide how you're going to die by yourself without your community, without this understanding that people are going to remember you, whether you want them to or not, really, right? This is the reality that you do belong to other people. And therefore, that autonomy is preventing you from dying well, right? That is to me, that's one of the biggest cultural lies that we're currently living in, is that everyone thinks they're an autonomous individual, right? Living only for themselves. And if you live only for yourself, then you're going to die only according to your own way of dying. And that's why people take death even into their own hands, because the reality of belonging to other people is not something they're feeling or tangibly aware of, if that makes sense. So I do think that, the autonomy is one of the ones that I address. I'm trying to remember the other sections of my book as well. Oh, and reality of resurrection. So thinking beyond the material or thinking beyond the empirical, right? How does resurrection change our approach in this life to death? in a way that I think is really fruitful and helpful to think through, right?
Thank you.
So, yeah.
So forgive me if this question is way too many questions into one question.
Okay.
So when I think about literature that has had the most, like the literature I've read that has the most powerful pictures of death, a lot of them are people coming from non-Protestant traditions. Dostoevsky and Flannery O'Connor, two really big ones. And I'm wondering if, and I'm thinking, it seems like the Protestant tradition, there's a tendency to pass over the death. Like we don't have last rites, we don't have crucifixes hanging on our walls. And I'm not necessarily proposing we start doing that, but how might that affect a Protestant artistic imagination of death? And how might we reawaken an imagination informed by contemplating death in a healthy way?
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
So before I jump into the Protestant versus Catholic Orthodox imaginations, which is actually like my specialty, so it's totally fine to go that direction, I did want to say one more thing about Dr. Thomas's point, because I thought of a film that, well, there's actually several. I wrote on this somewhere. Like Dr. Hewlin said, I write a lot, and so I don't know where. But I wrote on, I think you could probably Google my name and death and something would come up. But essentially, I wrote about how our media is lying to us about what death is. And I forgot that I did that, but I did. And so I talked about the end of The Good Place, and I talked about the end of, what is that movie where everybody becomes avatars in a different world, and it's like a video game? No, it's like based on a really old Robin Williams movie, and there's a redone version of it. Jumanji 2. Yes, okay. Jumanji 2 ends with a guy who's dying, and instead of going back to the real world and dying, he turns into an avatar horse. I mean, okay, so you could never just sit and enjoy a movie with me because I get into like philosophical debate with every single film that I'm watching. That drove me nuts, so much so that I wrote whatever this thing was about how our culture is lying to us about death. So that's another cultural lie, right? Like death to be escaped, death to be avoided. That you become an avatar horse in a video game. Like that's more fulfilling. No one else finds that really weird? It's really weird. Okay, so now to your question. So there's a lot to go into with the Protestant Catholic imagination and what happens. One of the things that you already mentioned was taking the body off the cross, right? Which means you don't want to deal with the Good Friday as often. And so in the Protestant circles that I grew up in, we don't deal with the crucifixion as often as we dealt with Easter, resurrection, celebration of life, all of those things. That doesn't mean you have to go put the body back up on the cross for that to be the case, but just the reflection on Good Friday, returning to the sense of like the darkness is reality in life. There is darkness that precedes light, but light has overcome the darkness. And so we don't have to be afraid of digging into the dark. One of the things that happens, one of the reasons there was these manuals that were created, and this was both, this was in Protestant churches as well as Catholic churches. This was in Holbein did a bunch of illustrations of, and you can go and buy this stuff, of a manual of how to die well. And this was in the Protestant church. And one of the things they were doing was overcoming fear by turning to virtue. So the fears, possibly yes, the lies too, but like that's where the lies were coming from, was what we were afraid of, so we'd lie to ourselves. And so in these Protestant manuals, they were talking about a virtuous life overcoming the fears of death and all the ways that fear went through it. So there are things that I think the Protestant church is not as aware of because we don't have as healthy of a dialogue with tradition. So if you think about it in terms of the way we consider Scripture, Scripture is by itself, right? And so it's sola scriptura, so you don't have an interpretive tradition. Therefore, you don't pass down tradition. You don't value that as heavily as you do the scripture itself, right? But of course, the Bible was made by tradition, and therefore there should be some role of tradition in continuing to teach us how to live. And so Protestant communities, by returning to a healthy view of tradition, right, I think can revive some of this ways of approaching death that is part of our church, does not have to imitate a Catholic way of being or imitate an Orthodox way of being, but can imitate a biblical way of being in the world that really reveres that tradition.
Thank you. I do have a follow-up question.
Okay.
Sorry.
You're good.
Just really long. How might that change our imagination? I'm still, can you say more about what that will do to art? I know that's really general.
Yeah, no, that is really general. So I was in Dr. Beaver's class the other day, and we were talking about this divide between the Protestant and Catholic imagination. And Protestants get super nervous that I'm Catholic, right? But I'm not. And I say that because what I'm about to say might also, again, sound like I'm Catholic, but I'm not. So I'm just going to keep saying I'm not Catholic. The Protestant church, because they were protesting in order to found themselves, protested against everything that seemed Catholic, whether or not it was biblical. So anything that came before 1500 became suspect. One of the things I'm trying to do in the Protestant church is ressourcement, return us to the things that were always biblical and that belong to our history and our tradition, that we don't have to protest any longer. I think we've established ourselves, and we can actually reclaim as part of our beliefs and our faith. And so I do believe a lot has been lost, especially with art. So if you look at what happens in the Reformation, Brad Gregory writes this book, The Unintended Reformations. Some of the things that happen is we throw out art. We become mistrusting of hagiography. We become mistrusting of miracles. We become mistrusting of some of these things because they sound Catholic, right? But narratives and arts should have always been ours. And so I love Protestant novelists, right? Frederick Buechner is probably my favorite. Leif Enger. There's some great Protestant novels out there that we need to be reading and amplifying their voices. And I love Flannery O'Connor. That doesn't mean I'm not going to give up Flannery O'Connor. Yeah. But at this, I'm just not going to do that. But at the same time, there are great Protestant novelists, and so we have to also reclaim our imagination and the works from our imagination. Thank you. Yeah. I just outed myself. There's so many Catholics that think I'm Catholic that they just had to hear that over and over again.
Well, thank you. I
Yeah.
had to follow up on that because
Yeah.
I'm a church history guy, and I'm also an oddball Lutheran here in a Baptist school.
Yeah.
And the first Protestants, Luther was a big fan of the crucifix and thought it was a very evangelical symbol and retained much of the Mass and, the whole, everything you're talking about. But that just, for various reasons, didn't click with the rest of the Protestant. Anglicans do that
Right.
now. But I guess my question is, even 50, 60 years ago, the most un-Catholic Protestants still had a focus on death, physical and spiritual death, and then life in Christ, new life and so forth. That what you've talked about wouldn't have been unusual for most of Christianity, but I sort of sense from my study that the churches, especially in the mid-20th century, began to move toward a more therapeutic understanding of the faith, more about my problems, feeling better about myself. And so death becomes more an uncomfortable topic, it's not something, and so I wonder if you've detected, it's not necessarily Protestant Catholic, it's something has changed in the churches, and now the churches are not in good shape when it comes to dealing with death and so forth. So
I think it's also a Gnostic problem. That's where I would see the real roots of the problem. Because in Gnosticism, if you're going to fix everything with knowledge, but you can't fix death, then you're suddenly up against a wall that you don't want to face because you have this belief in our ability to fix everything, right? So in the 20th century, when we start being able to fix everything, that's one of those things we can't do. We are faced with our own limitations, which becomes a problem, right? And then we become ashamed of that. I think there's multiple things that have contributed to this, right? We also have this move towards consumerism. And if you're going to be an endless consumer, you can't die. And so then that also becomes a big hurdle, right, for the consumer-driven world, because if they're trying to convince you always to be happy, they can't let you face your own death, because then you're not happy and then you're not going to buy things. Right, and so I think there's just lots of cultural contributions to this that the church has bought into, not just the Protestant church or Catholic church, but just the church, the Christians have bought into a more American, a more worldly way of being than what we were called to originally.
I've got to add one other adjective there. It seems like you're talking about technological Gnosticism, right? If you're talking about Gnosticism that can fix things through knowledge, then you're talking about knowledge as a technology, right? And obviously, there's a whole Gnosticism that's induced by our staring into screens at virtual things all day long.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, you have this bifurcation that happens without even your knowing it. It's another way we've talked a lot about being enslaved. Again, to bring up Dr. Thomas's point, to being enslaved to cultural lies. Right. And those are some of those cultural lies that become part of your habits, which become part of your practices, and means you can't even find your way out of it. So if you're living your life through your phone or your screen, you don't even realize that you're afraid of death because you've been distracted so much from even considering that question that you've lost the thread, right? Like it's not something you're facing or thinking about.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Wilson, you have really challenged us to imagine ourselves and our lives and our world and even our Lord differently and more biblically and more healthily, I would say, through this series of lectures. So I'm really grateful that you've spent the time with us, and I think the rest of these folks are too. So would you please thank her one more time?
Thank you.
Wow, that's good. We're going to be chewing on this for weeks now, all of this that we've had in these last 4 lectures. Just a few things before we adjourn tonight. First of all, I want to thank the provost, John Netland, for his ongoing support of the Scholar in Residence program. It's a big blessing to me that we've had that unqualified support all these years for this. So thank you very much, John. Also, want to thank Rebecca Edgren for all the logistical work she did to organize. Yes, absolutely. Rebecca Edgren is the queen of logistics, and she made all of these events and so many others happen, and we thank her for that. Also want to thank Creative Dining and IT folks for their kind of behind-the-scenes support of these events. So thank you very much, Ron. Appreciate you. And I also want to make 2 last plugs. One is, remember, we'll have books available over here, signed books available if you would like, immediately after the lecture. And we can take cash or card, but we can't take a check. My apologies. But we'll be glad to help you out however we can to get a book in your hands. And also, for those of you who are teaching at classical Christian schools or homeschool co-ops that maybe use classical curricula, I really want you to take a look at these seminars that we're offering this summer. What could be better than spending 5 days studying Virgil's Aeneid with Gavin Richardson? I mean, really, what a delight would that be, right? And then the second best option by far is an opportunity to study Plato's Republic with me for 5 days in July. So would really love to have interested parties of any sorts, but especially classical Christian school teachers who are realizing I'm going to have to teach the Aeneid next semester, who are terrified about that and want some help with it. Please come sign up for these seminars, and the more information available at uu.edu/honors. Thanks to all the folks who participated online. Thanks to all of you for coming tonight. Have a lovely evening, and please come get a book if you'd like.